In this segment, we're continuing with sort of World War I and the home front here in the United States. And this should be the final segment of this larger lecture. But in this segment, I want to emphasize sort of the broader implications for American civil rights. And that's a topic, of course, that I think has been sort of thematic throughout, really, whether we're talking about the civil rights of labor, of the wealthy, of African Americans, or for that matter, of women. The constitutional, the basic human rights even, that we enjoy. And really, what are the implications of a government-directed war effort when it comes to those civil rights? Remember that the purposes of the United States government in adopting sort of control over the war effort were not merely to ensure continued production of goods that were necessary to supply soldiers in the field, but also one of the purposes of the war effort for the government entailed building support for the war itself through appeals to patriotism. And so one element of this segment will talk about the appeal side of the government's war effort, but also through the passage and enforcement of laws that are aimed at coercion and silencing dissent. So there are really two sides to this government effort, and it's two sides that we see again and again. It's like most things in history. You're not going to see something that's just inevitably good and not bad, or something that's inevitably bad and not good. We don't, as historians, really use those terms terribly often, if at all, anymore. Good, bad. Instead, you often see multiple facets, or at a minimum, sort of two sides of every act. And I think you see that here. You saw it with progressivism. You got a sense of, while progressivism is about reform, there's also that conservative element. Similarly, you could say the same thing about earlier movements like the Knights of Labor or the Farmers Alliance, in which there were elements of racism even when there were calls for greater democratization politically. Reconstruction itself, the aspiration for freedom that is ultimately bound up with a history of neglect and abandonment. So World War I is much like that. I guess I need to move on just a bit and stop the sermon, but it's something that keeps coming back, and I just want you all to be aware of that. I want you to think about these things as we go. It's the multiple implications and facets of these historical events that we're talking about. Now, I mentioned that one way the government could go about achieving a sort of 100% Americanism, or certainly a grand sort of patriotic fervor for the goals of the war, had to do with something as basic to our lives as advertising. And advertising is not entirely new in 1917 or 1918. But in many ways, it will be the First World War that really allows advertising to take off. And we'll see that effect really coming to fruition in the 1920s as advertising moves more and more to draw consumers to certain purchases, and really more and more purchases. But, the United States had to figure out how to pay for this war. And one of the ways it was going to do that was through what were known as Liberty loans. During these Liberty loan drives, U.S. citizens were asked to purchase government bonds that would then go to support the war effort and ultimately sort of be repaid after the war was over. This was largely the responsibility of the Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo. But it relied upon the goodwill and the willingness of Americans to purchase these bonds. There were approximately 5 drives, I believe 5 drives, between 1917 and 1919. And ultimately, these Liberty bonds, or Liberty loan drives, managed to pay approximately 2/3 of the costs of the war, raised about $21 billion for the war effort, about 2/3. So a good chunk of the financial backing for the war comes from expressions of patriotism and the purchase of these war bonds by American citizens. But understand the degree to which these ideas of support for the war, of patriotism, can easily be bound up with sort of the alienation of certain groups of Americans. By alienation, I guess what I should really say is by turning a negative light on certain groups. Let me just give you a sense of what I mean, and we'll move forward. There are a number of ways in which Liberty loans were really sold to the public. It was done through posters, it was done through flags, through banners, and even more ways, movie stars, the use of celebrity, just this kind of fledgling celebrity of the early days of cinema that had begun to be brought into advertising and marketing. And it's being done during the First World War. But the other side of this, of course, is, and William Gibbs McAdoo says this at one point, only, quote, a friend of Germany, end quote, would refuse to buy bonds. See, this is a two-edged kind of sword. I mean, it depends on how the wielder of the sword wishes to use the power of advertising, the power of marketing. To what ends? Is it to appeal for positive action, or is it to denigrate, to achieve what we might perceive as a negative action? It's a fascinating kind of study on this early use of what we ultimately might call propaganda, certainly marketing techniques, or spin. Within 8 days of the beginning of the First World War for the United States, certainly, I guess a better way to put it would be U.S. entry into the war, Woodrow Wilson has established what will come to be known as the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. Sometimes this committee is known as the Creel Committee. And that's because its chair, the person who chaired this committee, which was a committee or commission of 3 people, really, the person who chaired it, his name was George Creel. Now, George Creel was primarily known before the war as one of the many muckraking journalists that we talked about when we talked about progressivism and the progressive era, and people like Ida Tarbell going after the trusts. He's a Westerner. He spent time, for instance, out in Colorado, but he's also a huge supporter of Woodrow Wilson through his journalism and his skills as a writer. When the war first breaks out, when the U.S. first enters the war, Creel is very much concerned that the government will turn to direct censorship to make sure that public opinion is kept positive toward the war. In other words, that the government will try and stop the press from writing anything negative about the war effort or war aims. So Creel, again, this person who's known to Wilson and known to the Democratic Party, and also from a progressive background, appeals to the president to emphasize not censorship, not sort of this negative approach, but instead to emphasize making sure that newspapers and media outlets of the day play up the positive aspects of the war, build patriotism through the tools at their disposal. One way that this was put was the idea that the CPI, right, the Committee on Public Information, had a purpose of combating rumor with facts. This was going to be done through every means available to Creel and the United States government. I've mentioned posters, and I usually have some examples of World War I era posters in lecture, and I hope you'll have a chance to see those as we go. But, I mean, one of the most outstanding, most iconic figures of the day would be, of course, Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam emerges during World War I as a truly iconic figure reflecting patriotic feeling, but tying that patriotic feeling to participation in the war effort. You know, the great poster is Uncle Sam with the finger pointed toward you saying, you know, I want you. Well, that, of course, is an appeal to young men or even potentially young women who might wish to volunteer for service in the United States military. So military service is tied to patriotism, and Uncle Sam becomes a real symbol of that patriotism and a sort of personification of this, well, of government in the United States. But there are many, many more posters. And in fact, Creel went out and found some of the most amazing of America's lithograph artists, people who had worked on posters and bills and flyers and things in the past, and used their art to sell goods or announce opportunities or celebrity events or whatever it may be, circuses, ways of reaching out to the general public that went beyond speeches and went beyond the written word. In other words, Creel recognized very early on that you could use the image to appeal to far more people oftentimes, and in a more evocative way than you could use words. So that some of the posters are, absolutely beautiful. But there are also posters that would have been part of the American home front scenery in 1917, 1918 that denigrate, for instance, Germans, that refer to Germans in a way that creates an image of barbarism, tendency toward violence, uses terms like the Hun. This process of dehumanization of opposition, of an enemy, is often something you see in war. It's often something you see in the emergency crisis atmosphere of war. And arguably, it's an extraordinarily dangerous thing. It's most often when this process of dehumanization is underway that you begin to see civil rights most threatened, when it becomes easier to go around the Constitution or around the laws. We see it from Lincoln with his suspension of habeas corpus. However, whatever you think about that, through Woodrow Wilson, and what we're going to talk about here in just a moment. So there's the positive and the negative for the Creel Commission or the CPI. But it's not just going to be posters. Again, Creel is going to use the most modern techniques. So for instance, cinema, actors who are emerging as celebrities will be asked to participate in, among other ways, they'll be asked to become speakers, especially to promote the Liberty loans and the purchase of Liberty bonds. There'll be some 75,000 speakers who will participate as so-called 4-minute men. And that Minutemen business plays on the Revolution and the Minutemen, which I know you're familiar with. But the 4-minute men were speakers who limited their speeches to approximately 4 minutes. And they were very strict about this. Every word has to count, unlike these lectures, that I guess you're hearing from me. But every word has to count, 4 minutes, and you're done. You've got to get the message out. You've got to keep people interested and get them to buy bonds in 4 minutes. So celebrities who were actors who could stick to a script were particularly useful in this regard. Plus, they drew large crowds. And think about how marketing, advertising is going to draw on the ability of celebrity. It still does to this day, doesn't it? the ability of celebrity to draw crowds, to promote product. Films, there were short films that were made using celebrities and actors. Hollywood is just a fledgling sort of place at this point. Again, there's a positive and there's a negative. But you do need to know the 4-Minute Men. You need to understand they're selling Liberty bonds. You need to understand how celebrities use. You need to understand advertising, posters, as well as the written word, advertisements. But here again, we come back to this sort of negative. Remember, the purpose of the CPI was to combat rumors with facts. Well, just because something's rumor doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue. Not some truth to it. You could argue that the real purpose of the CPI wasn't to combat rumor with fact in the end, but to ensure that the perception of the war remained positive. That's what Creel had always really been about, I think. And so you began to see creeping into the purposes of the CPI such little things as posters and talks that were encouraging Americans to report on neighbors who were engaged in suspicious activities. And that goes to a topic here that'll lead us into this business of coercion. And I'll try to wrap this up fairly quickly, but this war, remember, is being fought, when the war that the United States enters is being fought against Germany, against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, against the Turks. It is a war that is intimately bound up with ideas in this country, in the United States, that relate to immigration. And so once again, nationality, but more importantly, ethnicity, begins to play in here. In the earliest days of the war, there were numerous occasions where citizens would seek to demonstrate their loyalty by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, by wrapping themselves in the flag, but also instances where they would seek to force someone else to demonstrate loyalty by doing one or more of those acts. Pledging allegiance, for instance, taking an oath, saluting the flag. You might imagine, given the nature of the enemies in this war, a lot of this focus on demonstrating loyalty was, focused on Germans, people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from what we might consider portions of Eastern Europe, certainly Central Europe, Southern Europe. That's where immigration comes in. Consider for a moment that in the midst of the heat of America going to war, German books vanished from library bookshelves, sometimes removed by librarians, sometimes removed by an eager public. Consider for a moment that names were changed, and it goes back to that cultural importance of language. Shakespeare, what's in a name? Well, a heck of a lot. Words are symbols, but they're extraordinarily powerful because those symbols really shape the way we think about the world. And it may not seem like a big deal, but the fact of the matter is that the flag is a symbol, and you wrap yourself in that symbol, you're making a statement. And that statement will be understood in the way people understand the world. You change the name of Hamburger. You're familiar with Hamburger, as in Hamburg, Germany. You change Hamburger to Salisbury steak. You change sauerkraut to Liberty cabbage. It's often struck me that we saw much the same thing in the early 21st century when, as sad as it was, when the Twin Towers were attacked on 9/11. I remember distinctly questions being raised about terms related to who was supporting the U.S., who wasn't supporting the U.S. It happens over and over again in human history. It's not entirely new with World War I or before or after. But by gosh, it's something that we have to stay alert for. It's something we have to think about and be aware of and be cautious of. These changes in language and the pressures in the moment, in the heat of the moment, to act aggressively. Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms were ejected from the canon of often played tunes, replaced by the tunes of our allies and the traditional tunes of American history. There were beatings, there was denigration, and we saw that in 9/11. And there was suspicion, a thought that someone of German extraction, someone born in Germany and living here only a short time, perhaps a new immigrant, might be a threat, might have ulterior purposes, might be loyal to another nation. It's not something you can say, well, gee, I don't know why people felt that way. Certainly we can understand the fear. Certainly we can understand, what it meant to live in the U.S. and perhaps be fearful of a neighbor. But then there's the action. How does one address those fears? And it also perhaps raises questions about how well we know our neighbors or ever can. Well, government, too, it turns out, is going to be engaged in asking these very questions. Who's trustworthy? Who's not? And what ought we to do about the fear we face of espionage and saboteurs? In June of 1917, the United States Congress passes, and Wilson will sign the so-called Espionage Act. Now, this act is intended to halt interference with the recruiting of troops, to stop the disclosure of any information related to national defense whose release might be dangerous to the war effort. But also it covered conscientious objectors and wartime profiteering. One of the things the War Industries Board was intended to control, but actually didn't do a terribly good job of controlling, apparently. Profiteering, making money off the war. This law, the Espionage Act, imposed a $10,000 fine and 20 years of imprisonment for violations of this act, and in particular gave the Postmaster General of the United States the power to interfere with the United States mail, removing suspected materials from the mail, which meant effectively that you could be sending something like a newspaper, and that could be read, and if it was thought to be defamatory to the war effort or portray the war effort in a negative light, could be removed from the United States mail. In May of 1918, a further effort to legislate regarding the war effort was passed, known as the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act. This act amended and supplemented the Espionage Act of 1917, providing heavy penalties for, and I want to be very careful here, so I may look away from you just a second to make sure I get it just right, but heavy penalties for using, quote, disloyal, profane, or scurrilous language about the government, the flag, the Constitution, or the United States military. These same heavy penalties could be employed should you be charged with and convicted of obstructing the sale of war bonds. The consequences of the passage of these laws in terms of civil rights are truly impressive. Granted, it's a wartime situation, but rights are rights, and it is a severely important question as to when, if ever, citizens of the United States surrender their rights. But to give you just some consequences, Some 1,500 pacifists, socialists, and others would be arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Act. 3 examples I'd like to give you. The first, you've heard about this individual, and that's Eugene V Debs. Debs is a well-known socialist. In June of 1918, he's giving a speech in Canton, Ohio. He does proffer, though he walked a very fine line trying to stay out of trouble with these laws, he proffers some negative opinion about the war effort and about service in the war effort. He's prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and Eugene V Debs, socialist and presidential candidate and major figure in the labor movement, will serve 10 years in prison and will be disfranchised for life. His sentence is upheld by the United States Supreme Court. Another example is that of Big Bill Haywood. Now, I've mentioned Haywood in connection, or I think I have, in connection with the International Workers of the World, or the so-called Wobblies. Haywood has a checkered past. He's been involved in considerable violence, part of the labor movement of the time. In 1907, he was actually hauled up for trial over conspiracy to commit murder when the governor of Idaho was attacked with a bomb. In that particular instance, Big Bill Haywood was found not guilty. At least he was let go. There wasn't enough evidence, at least the jury thought, to hold him. He'd been long associated with labor unions, and I've mentioned his connection to the Wobblies, but you can understand that socialist element is present. And when the war, it looks as if the United States is headed toward war before 1917, Haywood is one of those figures who's out there really blasting Wilson and blasting the United States for this kind of gradual shift toward a war footing, toward entry into World War I, because he's arguing, hey, it's all just a big capitalist conflict. If you think in terms of class, as any good socialist would, and putting government in the hands of the lower classes or the working classes, then this war would never be taking place. National interest would not subsume the interests of class. Well, in 1915, Big Bill Haywood becomes the formal leader of the Wobblies, IWW. And in 1918, for basically calling for strikes in America's industry and for promoting resistance to the war effort, like suggesting the young men avoid response to selective service, but also suggesting that workers engage in work slowdowns at the work site if by law, which they were prevented, remember, they couldn't just outright strike. Bill Haywood saying slow down the work. Well, that gets him in trouble. 1918, he is arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He's let out on bail, and Big Bill Haywood skips bail and heads off to Russia, where, if you know the international history, and I think Melanie Story may have talked a bit about this, there's a revolution underway, the Bolsheviks, which will lead, of course, to the creation of the Soviet Union. One final example I would like to mention, and that's the example of Congressman Victor Berger. Berger is a longtime, well-known congressman from Wisconsin. He's also a socialist, one of the founding members of the Social Democratic Party in the United States. He's going to get in trouble basically for materials that are found in the U.S. mail, for comments that he will make largely in the press. And once that material is picked up and found to be seditious, this congressman, a U.S. congressman, will be sentenced to some 20 years in prison and denied his congressional seat. He's just been reelected. He's a congressman-elect, the House of Representatives, and he will be denied his seat in the House, even though he was elected by the people of Wisconsin. Now, all the examples I've given you are socialists. But understand, it didn't take that level of radicalism to get you in trouble with these acts. It only took the wrong word in the wrong place, even to the point of criticizing the uniforms of the American military. So you may ask, where's the Supreme Court in all this? Well, in 1919, the Supreme Court will deliver a very, very important decision in the United States on freedom of speech. And the decision itself is Schenck versus United States, 1919. In this decision, the Supreme Court upholds the Espionage Act. And speaking for the majority, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes expresses a unanimous opinion. I mean, the decision is unanimous, that free speech must be protected in the United States, but even free speech has its limits. And that limit is ultimately reached at the point where my free speech may potentially cause harm to another person. In other words, free speech may be curtailed when there is, by process of employing my free speech, going to be, and this is a quote, clear and present danger to public safety. The often used image is that of the crowded theater, and the idea that one cannot simply cry fire, fire, fire in a crowded theater if there is no fire. And if crying fire, crying out that there's an alarm or an emergency, may lead to some sort of physical or other damage to other human beings. The court decides in this very important decision that there are indeed specific limits to free speech in the United States. That's an outgrowth of the First World War. It's a question with which we still struggle when we talk about things like hate speech. Where are the limits? It's a debate that we ought to be engaged in, and I hope you will be. But I hope you'll be engaged knowing the background, the historical roots. And that's why I think the First World War is so important. Why are there so many commercials on TV, and why are they done the way they're done, and where are the roots of that marketing and advertising? What about civil rights in this country? How are they impacted, things like free speech, by the new way of seeing the world that emerges during the First World War? What about the role of government in our lives? We've talked about it with the progressives. Here comes World War I, and it's amped up in wartime. All these elements, all these themes, they're present. And I hope coming out of this lecture, perhaps you'll have a better sense of how they're integrated into the history to follow, and indeed the world we live in.